One sentence before we begin, said plainly, because of what tonight is about. This episode concerns the death of a child. It is handled historically and without detail, and there is nothing graphic in it. But if that is close to you at the moment, you may want to choose something else tonight, and there is no shame at all in doing that. There is a note in the description with where to find people who help with this. There is a lamp burning in a flat in St. Petersburg, late in the spring of 1878, and a man is sitting near it, not doing anything at all. His wife is watching him from the doorway. She wrote afterwards that what frightened her was not the weeping. It was that he had gone quiet and stayed quiet, and she did not know what he would do if he stayed in that flat. You may know the particular silence she was looking at, and you may also know the question that arrives underneath it later when everybody has gone. Not why did this happen, but the colder one. What was it for? What came back in exchange? Because a loss with nothing on the other side of it is very difficult to hold, and the mind goes looking, and there is an enormous industry waiting with answers that do not work. Tonight we sit with a man who had every resource for making a loss mean something, used all of them, and then refused to pretend it had worked. 9 days earlier, his son Alexei had died. He was 2 years and 9 months old. The family called him Alyosha, Chapter 1. The thing that has not resolved, and what we are actually asking. Begin with the reason you might be awake. There is a kind of loss that does not behave the way you were told it would. You were told it comes in stages, and that they proceed in order, and that at the end of them is something called acceptance, after which it is finished. That is not what happened. What happened is that it went quiet for a while, and then arrived in the supermarket. That you were fine for 6 weeks, and then flattened by a coat in a hallway. That the anniversary was easier than an ordinary Tuesday in March for no reason you could name. And underneath all of it, the thing nobody says out loud, the suspicion that you are doing it wrong, that other people got through this, that there was a process and you failed to complete it. I want to say, before anything else, that there is no such process, and that this is not an opinion. The research on this is unusually clear, and it has been clear for 35 years, and almost none of it has reached the public. There is a second thing under it, and it is harder. At some point, usually late, usually alone, the question arrives. What was it for? Not in a philosophical way, in an accounting way. Something was taken, and the mind, which is an inveterate maker of sense, goes looking for what was received in exchange, because a transaction with nothing on one side is very difficult to hold, and there is an enormous industry ready to answer. Everything happens for a reason. They are at peace. You are stronger now. It brought the family together. God has a plan. Some people find those genuinely sustaining, and I am not going to take them off anybody. But a great many people have had those sentences said to them and have discovered that they do not work, and that saying so is not socially permitted. And so they have added a second private grief on top of the first. the grief of not being able to make it mean anything. That is who tonight is for. There is one more thing I want to say at the start, and then we will begin properly. Nothing tonight is going to tell you how long it should take. That is the single most common piece of damage done to bereaved people, and it is done almost entirely by well-meaning people repeating something they heard a year, 2 years. The first Christmas is the worst. It gets easier after 18 months. None of those numbers has anything behind it. They are folklore, they vary enormously between people, and the only thing they reliably do is give somebody a schedule to fail against. If it has been 11 years and something can still take your legs out in a supermarket, you are not behind. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of you settle into whatever is holding it. There is nothing you need to do for the next 3 hours, and nothing in this asks anything of you. It is worth adding one more thing about the shape of it, because almost nobody is warned. It does not get smaller, the gaps get longer. That is the actual pattern most people report, and it is different from what they were promised. The intensity of any given episode does not reliably decline. What changes is how often it comes and how much life there is in between. Which means that 10 years in, an episode can be exactly as bad as one in the first month, and be perfectly compatible with a life that is otherwise entirely functional. People frequently take one of those late episodes as evidence that they have made no progress at all. They have. The progress is in the calendar, not in the intensity. Chapter 2. Why this man and what this evening is not. There is a reason to spend 3 hours on a Russian novelist, and it is not literary. It is that he had every possible resource for making a loss mean something, and he used all of them, and he still refused to pretend it had worked. He was religious, seriously, and by conviction. He had a monastery and a spiritual director. He had a vocation and a public. He was, by common agreement, one of the 2 or 3 people in the century best equipped to make sense of suffering, and it had been his subject for 30 years. And when it was his own child, he wrote, into the middle of his last and greatest book, the strongest case against the whole enterprise that anybody has ever put on paper, and he gave it to a character he disagreed with, and he made it unanswerable, and he told his editor privately that he was worried his reply was not strong enough. That is not a man with a lesson. That is a man being honest in public about something he could not do, and it is worth a night. Housekeeping, and on this subject I want to be careful. Nothing tonight is medical advice. Nothing tonight is a diagnosis. Nothing tonight is telling you how to grieve, and if anything in it does not fit your experience, then your experience is the more reliable instrument. I will not use the word closure. I will not offer any stages. I will not suggest that you should be finding a meaning, and one of the findings later is specifically that being pressed to find one is unhelpful. The sources are good. Anna Dostoevsky's memoir, the letters, particularly the correspondence with his editor Lyubimov during the composition, the novel, and for the second half, the grief literature from 1989 onward. One more thing. there is a second dead child in his life. His first daughter, Sonia, died in Geneva in 1868 at 3 months old. She is not the subject tonight, but you should know she existed because Alyosha was the second, and a man burying a second child is in a different position from a man burying a first. It is worth adding one caution about the sources, and it applies especially to the memoir. Anna wrote her reminiscences in old age, decades after these events, as a woman who had spent her entire widowhood managing her husband's reputation. She is protective. She smooths. Where her diary from the 1860s and the memoir from the 1910s disagree, historians generally take the diary. But for this period, we mostly have only the memoir, because the diary had long stopped by 1878. So when I tell you what she saw in the flat that May, I am telling you what a grieving mother wrote down 40 years later about the worst fortnight of her marriage, and that is the best evidence anybody has, and it is not the same as a record. It is worth adding what we do not have from this period, because the gaps are large. We have almost nothing from him. There is very little correspondence from the weeks after the death. No diary and no account written at the time. What we have is Anna's memoir, written decades later, and the novel, which means the single most consequential fortnight in this story is documented by one interested party in old age and by a work of fiction. I would rather tell you that clearly than build 3 hours on it and hope you do not ask. One more thing about what is missing from the record, and it is the largest absence of all. We have almost nothing about the boy. A handful of lines in his mother's memoir, written 40 years later. His name, his age, the date, that he was affectionate, that he resembled his father. That is the whole of it, for a child whose death produced the greatest novel in the language, which is ordinary rather than exceptional. Almost nobody who dies at 2 leaves a record, and what survives of them is held entirely in the memories of 3 or 4 people, and then those people die. I mention it because a certain number of listeners are carrying somebody whose entire remaining existence is inside them, and who will end when they do, and there is no comfort available for that, and it deserves saying out loud, rather than being stepped around. Chapter 3. The Household in 1878 and the 16th of May. By 1878 his life was, for the first time, in order. The gambling had stopped 7 years earlier and never returned. His wife Anna had taken over the business side and had cleared the debts by publishing him herself. He was 56. He was famous in a way no Russian writer had been, largely because of a monthly one-man periodical he wrote entirely alone, called A Writer's Diary, which had an enormous readership and which put him in a direct relationship with the country. They had 3 children: Lyubov, aged 9, Fyodor, aged 7, and Alyosha, born in August 1875, who was 2. Anna's memoir is the source for what the boy was like, and it is a mother writing 40 years later, so treat it accordingly. But she describes him as the one who most resembled his father. There is a detail she records that I will give you and then leave alone. Dostoevsky was, by every account, extremely affectionate with small children, and had been all his life, including with other people's, including in the years when he had nothing. I am going to do this in a small number of sentences. The boy had a seizure. It did not stop. A doctor was called, and then a second. It continued for several hours. He died in the afternoon. He was 2 years and 9 months old. There is a term for a seizure that does not stop, and it was as dangerous in 1878 as it is now, and there was, in 1878, essentially nothing that could be done. That is all I am going to say about it. It is worth adding what else was in that household in the spring of 1878, because the standard account has him at the height of his powers, and there was more to it than that. He was ill. The epilepsy had not improved, and the emphysema that killed him 3 years later was already established. He was 56 and looked considerably older. There were 2 other children in the flat, aged 9 and 7, who also lost a brother that afternoon, and who are almost entirely absent from every account of this, including this one, because the documents are about the adults. And there was a household to keep running, which is a thing that does not stop for a death, and which fell, as it usually does, on the person who was also organizing everything else. It is worth adding what the household was like in practical terms, because it explains why leaving was possible at all. They were, for the first time, financially secure. The debts had been cleared. Anna was running the publishing operation. There was money for a trip to a monastery and for somebody to cover things while he was gone. 10 years earlier, none of that would have been true, and he would have had to keep working through it, which is what almost everybody has to do. I mention it because the ability to stop for 2 weeks after a death is not a psychological resource. It is an economic one, and most people do not have it. And the requirement to keep functioning immediately is one of the more brutal, ordinary features of ordinary bereavement. One more thing about that spring, and it is the detail that makes the household legible. He had just come back from Ems. He had been taking a cure for the emphysema in Germany, alone, for weeks, as he did most years by then. The letters home from those trips are full of longing for the children and complaints about the water and anxiety about money. He came back in the spring of 1878 to a flat with 3 children in it, and within a short time there were 2. I mention it because the standard image of this period is a great writer at the height of his powers, and the actual texture of it was a sick man of 56 coming home from a health resort to a household he had been missing. Chapter 4. What his father believed. Dostoevsky had had epilepsy for at least 30 years. It was severe. He had recorded every seizure in his notebooks for decades. And he believed, immediately and completely, that the boy had inherited it from him, and that he had therefore caused this. Whether he was right in the medical sense is not something anybody can answer, then or now, and it does not matter for tonight. What matters is that he believed it from the first day, and that it never left him. I want to name that specifically, because it is the least discussed and most common feature of this kind of loss. A very large proportion of bereaved parents believe they caused it or could have prevented it, and hold that belief with complete conviction, and it is very often not true, and the untruth of it makes no difference whatsoever to how hard it is held. It is not a conclusion arrived at from evidence. It is a thing that arrives with the loss, and it arrives regardless of the facts, and it is one of the hardest parts of it to say out loud, because saying it invites reassurance, and reassurance does not touch it. It is worth adding how common that belief is, because people who have it generally assume they are alone in it. Studies of bereaved parents consistently find that a large proportion, in some samples a majority, hold themselves responsible in some way, including in deaths where no reasonable account of causation involves them at all. Accidents nobody could have foreseen. Illnesses with no known cause. Deaths that occurred while the parent was doing exactly what any parent would have been doing. The belief does not track the facts, which means it is not produced by the facts. It appears to be produced by the loss itself, and because it is not produced by evidence, it is not removed by evidence, which is why reassurance does so little, and why so many people stop mentioning it after the third or fourth time somebody tries to talk them out of it. It is worth adding what the belief is doing if it is not tracking evidence. The most persuasive account I know is that it is preferable to the alternative. If you caused it, then the universe is one in which small children die for reasons, and the reasons are causal, and causation is the kind of thing that can in principle be understood and prevented. If you did not cause it, then it happened for no reason at all to a 2-year-old, and there is nothing whatever to be done about a world that does that. Guilt is terrible, and it is a smaller terror than meaninglessness, and people take the smaller one, and they do not know they are choosing. It is worth adding what happens to the belief over time, because it does not simply fade. It usually goes underground and stays operational. People stop mentioning it because reassurance is exhausting to receive, and because they can see it makes the listener uncomfortable. And then it continues to run uncontested for decades, shaping how they read their own competence in unrelated areas. Which is why it is worth saying out loud once, to somebody qualified, even years later, not to be talked out of it, which does not work. To have it examined by somebody who will take it seriously as a belief rather than treating it as an obvious error. Chapter 5. Why she sent him away. Anna's account of the following weeks is the most useful thing in the memoir. She says he did not rage and did not collapse, and that this was what frightened her. He went quiet. He became, in her word, deadened, and she says she was afraid for what would happen if he stayed in the flat with it. So she arranged for him to leave. Now I want to be careful here, because it is easy to make Anna into the practical one who managed the sensitive genius, and the record does not support that. Her own diary and letters make clear she was destroyed too. She had carried the child and lost him at 2, and she was 31 and had already buried one baby in Geneva 10 years earlier. What she is doing in these weeks is not the calm management of somebody else's grief. It is a woman in the middle of her own, looking at her husband and making a judgment about what he could survive. She had wanted him to make this particular journey for years. It was something he had talked about, and she used the moment, It is worth saying something more about Anna in those weeks, because she is easy to read as the capable one. She had buried a child before. Sonia, in Geneva, 10 years earlier, at 3 months old. She was 21 then. She wrote about it afterwards in terms that make quite clear it never resolved. So the woman standing in the doorway watching her husband go quiet was not somebody managing an unfamiliar situation from a position of strength. She was somebody who knew exactly what was coming, for both of them, because she had already been through the first year of it once. And she was 32, and she made the arrangements anyway, and nobody in the record appears to have made any for her. It is worth adding one more thing about the arrangement she made. She did not go with him. She stayed in Petersburg with the 2 surviving children, aged 9 and 7, both of whom had just lost their brother, and one of whom was old enough to understand it completely. So the arrangement that has come down to us as an act of care for her husband was also, necessarily, a decision to handle the rest of it alone for a fortnight. That is not remarked on anywhere in the literature as far as I have found, and it is the most ordinary thing in this whole story. And it is what happens in most households after a death. One person's grief gets attended to, and one person's gets scheduled around. It is worth adding one more thing about the 2 surviving children. They both remembered it. Lyubov, who was 9, wrote a memoir of her father decades later. It is not a reliable book, and historians treat it with caution. And she was writing about a household in which a death had happened when she was old enough to understand it, and too young to be told anything. The literature on surviving siblings is thin and consistent about one thing. They are the group most likely to be overlooked in the household and afterwards, and the overlooking tends to be complete rather than partial. Nobody in this story is looking after them. That is not a criticism of anybody in 1878. It is simply what happens. Chapter 6. 2 men on a train, and the old man they went to see. The man who took him was Vladimir Solovyov. Solovyov was 25. He was already regarded as the most gifted philosopher of his generation in Russia, and he would go on to be one of the most influential figures in Russian thought. He and Dostoevsky had become friends despite the 30 years between them. They travelled in late June, some 6 weeks after the death, to Optina Pustyn, a monastery about 130 miles southwest of Moscow in the forest. Optina was, at that moment, the most important spiritual center in Russia, and it was important for a specific and rather unusual reason. It had revived the tradition of the starets, the elder, a monk not necessarily senior in the institutional hierarchy to whom people came for direct spiritual guidance. And these were not primarily monks or aristocrats. Peasants walked, sometimes for weeks, to speak to the elder at Optina. So did Gogol. So did Tolstoy, 3 times. The elder in 1878 was Ambrose, in English Ambrose. He was 66 or 67, and he had been at Optina for most of his adult life. He was in poor health, largely confined, and he received a stream of visitors daily for decades. The accounts of him are consistent in an unexpected way. They do not describe severity, They describe an old man who was funny. He gave advice in rhymes and jokes. He was practical. People came with enormous metaphysical distress, and he asked them about their household. He is repeatedly described as cheerful, and by people who found this disconcerting given his condition. Dostoevsky met him 3 times over the 2 days, once in the crowd of ordinary visitors and twice alone. We do not know what was said. There is no transcript, and neither man wrote one. Anna's memoir records only what her husband told her afterwards, briefly, and Solovyov said little. What we do know is what Dostoevsky did with it, and that is not a matter of inference at all, because he put it in a book. It is worth explaining what a starets actually was, because the word does not translate and the institution is unfamiliar. Not a priest, necessarily, not an abbot, not somebody with a position in the hierarchy at all. An elder was a monk to whom people came individually to disclose everything and receive direction, and whose authority came entirely from being recognized as somebody who could do it. The tradition had been suppressed for long periods and had been revived at Optina in the 19th century. The important structural fact is that it was open. Peasants walked for weeks. There was a queue, and you joined it, and the queue did not care who you were. Which is why a famous novelist and a woman who had walked from another province were waiting in the same room, and why he was seen among the crowd first and given the private meetings second. It is worth adding what Optina meant to Russian writers specifically, because he was not the only one. Gogol went. Tolstoy went 3 times, including in the last days of his life, when he left home at 82 and travelled there and could not bring himself to go in. There is something in that pattern worth noticing. 3 of the great skeptical intelligences of the century, all of them at odds with the institutional church, all of them at various points making the journey to a monastery in a forest to talk to a monk. Not for doctrine. None of them was short of doctrine. For something else which is harder to name and which appears to have been available there and not elsewhere. It is worth adding one more thing about the queue at Optina. He waited in it. He was, in 1878, the most famous living writer in Russia. He had a monthly readership that treated him as an oracle, and the arrangement at Optina was that you joined the crowd of ordinary visitors and were seen in turn. He was received among them first, and given the private meetings afterwards, and the accounts are clear about the order. Whatever else that fortnight was, it began with a man whose entire public identity was that of somebody people came to for answers, standing in a line with peasants to ask for one. Chapter 7. What he did with it. He began writing The Brothers Karamazov within a few months. And in the second book of it, early on, there is a scene in a monastery. An elder is receiving ordinary visitors, mostly peasant women, one after another in a queue. Among them is a woman who has come a long way. She tells him she has lost her son. He is her 4th child to die and the last one. She cannot stop grieving. She has left her husband and her home, and she is simply walking, and she says she cannot be comforted and does not want to be. And the elder asks her the boy's name. She says, Alexei. And she says he was 3 years old. His own son's name, his own son's age. rounded to the nearest year. He took his own dead child and gave him to an invented peasant woman in a novel, and put the words he had been given at Optina into the mouth of an invented monk so that the monk could say them to her. He gave the consolation away rather than keeping it. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of what he did, because it is easy to read past. He took the most private thing that had ever happened to him and put it in a novel, in the mouth of a character addressed to another character, in a scene that thousands of people would read. And he made the invented child the same age and gave it his son's name. That is not concealment, and it is not confession. It is something else, and I am not sure there is a word for it. The material made completely public and completely unattributable at the same time. Anybody who knew the family would recognize it instantly. Nobody else would ever know. And he never explained it in print or in a letter, as far as anybody has found. It is worth adding what he took from Ambrose into the character, beyond the words, the manner. Zosima in the novel is not solemn. He is quick and practical and frequently funny, and he handles people's enormous metaphysical distress by asking about their household arrangements. That is exactly what the accounts of Ambrose describe, from many independent witnesses over decades, and it is not what a novelist inventing a holy man would produce. The invented version is grave, which is a small piece of evidence that the portrait is drawn from life rather than from a type. And it is also the most useful thing in it. The discovery that the person who actually helps is very often the one who declines to match the weight of the occasion. It is worth adding what he had done with grief before in the fiction, because the change is measurable. He had written dying children before, more than once, and they had been used for pathos, used to make an argument about poverty, used to demonstrate a character's cruelty, effective, deliberate, and instrumental. After 1878, that stops. The dead child in Karamazov is not doing work for a thesis. The scene with the peasant woman does not advance the plot and could be cut without affecting anything. And it is one of the few passages in the book that is simply somebody being spoken to kindly. Whatever else changed in him, his willingness to use a dead child as a device did. It is worth adding one more thing about the transposition, because it is the strangest detail in the whole story, and I have not made enough of it. He changed the sex of the mourner. The person who received the consolation at Optina was a father. The person who receives it in the book is a mother, and the passage is one of the most convincing depictions of a mother's grief in 19th century literature, which means he did not simply disguise himself. He moved the whole thing across into somebody with a different life and a different voice and a different kind of standing in the world, and gave her the words he had been given. Whatever that is, it is not concealment, and it is not self-pity, and I am not sure I have ever seen another writer do it. Chapter 8. What the monk says. I will not reproduce the passage. You should read it if you are ever able to. But the shape of what Zosima says to her is worth having, because it is not what you would expect, and it is not what a Victorian deathbed scene would produce. He does not tell her to stop. He does not tell her it was meant. He does not tell her she will see the boy again, in a way designed to close the subject. He tells her that this is how it will be for a long time, and that she should not be comforted, and that she should weep. He tells her that the weeping is not a failure. And then, at the end, he tells her something extremely practical about her husband, who is at home, alone, and who has also lost the child. He sends her home. The reason I raise the shape of it is that it is, almost point for point, what the modern literature would recommend, arrived at by a monastery tradition in the 19th century and written down by a bereaved father in 1879. Do not truncate it. Do not require the person to be consoled. Do not treat continued grief as pathology. Attend to the practical situation and the other people in it. It is worth adding what the monk does not do in that scene, because the omissions are the substance of it. He does not tell her the child is better off. He does not tell her that it was God's will, or that there is a plan, or that she will understand it later. He does not suggest that she should be further along than she is, or that her grief is excessive, or that continuing to weep shows a failure of faith. He tells her the opposite, that this is how it will be for a long time, and that she should not be consoled. For a scene written by a religious novelist inside a religious novel, that is an extraordinary amount of restraint, and it is the thing that has kept the passage alive for 145 years among readers who believe none of it. It is worth adding what the scene does with time. The elder tells her it will be a long while. Not that it will pass, not that it will get better, that this is how it will be for a long time, and that she should let it be, and that the weeping is not something to be got past. I keep returning to that because it is the single most useful sentence anybody says to a bereaved person, and almost nobody says it, because it sounds like withholding comfort. It is the comfort. The alternative, which is to promise improvement on a schedule, produces a person who is then failing at a timetable on top of everything else. It is worth adding what the scene gets right that almost no fictional consolation does. He lets her not be helped. She receives what the elder says, and she does not brighten, and she does not have a realization, and she leaves still grieving. The text is explicit that she goes home in the same state, only having been told to. A lesser writer would have given her some relief on the page because a reader wants it. He refuses, and the refusal is the reason people who have been bereaved still find the passage bearable. It is one of the very few depictions in literature of somebody being spoken to well and remaining exactly as sad afterwards. Chapter 9. The rest of the book, and the brother who says no. He wrote it over roughly 2 years, in monthly installments in a magazine, with the printer waiting, while ill, at 57 and 58. It is the longest thing he ever wrote. It is about a father and 3 sons, and a 4th who may be a son. It is about a murder. It is about Russia. It has a courtroom drama in it, and a saint's life, and a farce. And its hero, the youngest brother, the one the narrator calls his hero in the first sentence, is a novice at a monastery, and he is named Alyosha. The dedication is to Anna Grigorievna. The epigraph is a verse from the Gospel of John about a grain of wheat, that unless it falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. Those same words are on his gravestone. Anna chose them. Now, the part that makes this book different from every other consoling book, and the reason I think it is worth 3 hours in the dark, he did not write a comforting novel. In the middle of it, he set out the case against the whole thing, and he made it as strong as he could possibly make it, and he gave it to the middle brother, Ivan. Ivan is not a villain. He is intelligent, decent, and honest, and the argument he makes is the one that arrives at 1 in the morning. And what he does in a conversation with Alyosha in a tavern is refuse to argue about God's existence at all. He says he accepts it. For the sake of the conversation, he grants the whole thing, and then he says, "I do not accept the world." And then he starts reading out a list. It is worth adding one thing about the composition, because it bears on how the book reads. He was writing it in monthly installments to a deadline for a magazine while ill, which means the sections we are about to discuss were not written in the order a reader might imagine, and not with the leisure to revise. The chapter containing Ivan's argument went to the printer, and then he had to write the answer to it, having already committed himself in public. He wrote to his editor about exactly that pressure, that the refutation was coming, that it needed to be adequate, and that he was not certain it would be. That is a novelist in a genuinely uncomfortable position of his own making, and he made it deliberately. It is worth adding what the 3 brothers are for, structurally, because it explains why the argument is where it is. They are 3 answers to the same question. Dmitri is the body. Appetite, rage, generosity, no capacity for abstraction at all. Ivan is the intellect. Alyosha is faith, and he is the least convincing of the 3, which the author knew and complained about. And the 4th, Smerdyakov, is what happens when Ivan's argument is taken seriously by somebody without Ivan's decency, which is the sharpest thing in the book and is easy to miss. That structure means the argument against meaning is not an aside. It is one of the 3 legs the whole novel stands on, and removing it would collapse the thing. It is worth adding what the 4th brother is doing there, because he is the part people forget, and he is the sharpest thing in the book. Smerdyakov listens to Ivan. He is the one who takes the argument seriously and acts on it, and he is the reason the murder happens, and Ivan spends the last part of the novel discovering that he is responsible for a killing he did not commit and did not want, which is the author's actual answer to his own chapter, and it is not an answer at all in the philosophical sense. It is a consequence. He does not say the argument is wrong. He says, here is what happens when it is loose in a house. Chapter 10. The List. The list is of things done to children. Dostoevsky assembled it from newspaper reports, court records, and things he had read. Several of the cases are documented real cases from the Russian press of the 1870s. I am not going to read any of it to you. It is genuinely unbearable, and it is meant to be. He chose children deliberately, and Ivan says why, because with adults you can always construct an argument about desert and with a small child you cannot. And then Ivan makes the argument, and it has 3 moves. He says, suppose it is all true. Suppose at the end of everything there is a harmony, and the mother embraces the man who did that to her child, and everybody understands, and all is forgiven, and it is revealed that this was necessary. He says, I refuse to accept that harmony because it is being purchased with the suffering of one small child, and the price is too high, and no future joy could justify it. And then he says the thing that has been echoing for 145 years. He says he is not rejecting God, he is returning his ticket. It is worth saying why he chose children, because he explains it himself, and the explanation matters. Ivan says he will not talk about adults, because with adults there is always an argument available. They have eaten the apple, they know good and evil. Somebody can always be found to say that they had it coming, or that they made choices, or that the suffering is doing something. With a small child, none of that is available. There is no theory of desert that reaches them, so he deliberately restricts the argument to the one case where every consoling move is blocked in advance. That is not sensationalism. It is somebody constructing the strongest possible version of a position in order that the answer, if there is one, has to be an answer to the strong version. It is worth adding where the material came from, because it matters for how the chapter reads. He assembled it from newspapers, court reports, mostly from the Russian press of the 1870s, several of which have been identified. He kept clippings. Some of the cases are documented and can be traced, which means Ivan is not inventing atrocities to make a philosophical point. He is reading out things that had happened in that country in those years to actual children, and which the readers of the magazine could have remembered from the papers. That is a considerable escalation of what a novelist normally does, and it is the reason the chapter has never lost its force. It is worth adding what Ivan is not arguing. He is not arguing that God does not exist. He says so directly, more than once. He grants the whole apparatus for the sake of the conversation: God, the plan, the eventual harmony, the reconciliation of everything. His objection is moral rather than metaphysical. Given all of that, he says, the price is too high, and he declines to accept it. That is a much harder position to answer than atheism, and it is why the chapter has survived. You cannot dispose of it with an argument about design or a first cause. It is not a claim about the facts. It is a refusal of the terms. It is worth adding what Ivan says he is refusing, because the phrase is precise and gets misquoted. He says he is not rejecting God. He says he is returning the ticket. The image is of an entry pass to the final harmony, the state in which everything is reconciled and understood and forgiven. He does not deny that it exists. He says that if it was bought at that price, he declines to go in and hands the ticket back at the door, which is a much stranger and more troubling position than unbelief, because it accepts every premise and refuses the conclusion on moral grounds, and there is no argument from the other side that touches it. Chapter 11. He wrote it himself. Sit with what has just happened. That argument was written by a man who had, 18 months earlier, watched his own 2-year-old die of a condition he believed he had given him. He did not write it to knock it down. It is the most powerful thing in the book, and everybody who reads it knows that. And in his letters to his editor while he was writing it, he says he is worried. He says he has made the case against faith too strong, and that his answer, which is coming in the next section, may not be sufficient. He is anxious about it in writing, in real time. That is not a novelist arranging a debate. That is a man who has put the strongest version of the thing he is afraid of into a book in public and is not sure he can meet it. It is worth saying what he was risking by writing it. He was, by 1879, a public figure with a following that regarded him as a religious teacher. He wrote a monthly column that people read as guidance. He received letters asking him what to believe. And into the middle of his last book, in front of that audience, he put the most effective case against the whole thing that had ever been written in Russian. Some readers took it exactly as it was meant. Others took Ivan's chapter and used it permanently as ammunition, which he could have predicted and did. He wrote it anyway. That is worth more than any argument in the book. It is worth adding what he said about the risk in his letters. He was explicit that the argument would be strong and that some readers would take it and go. And he did it anyway, on the grounds that a faith which required the objection to be suppressed was not worth defending, and that anybody who had actually thought about it had already met the objection privately. Whether or not you share any of his convictions, that is an unusual amount of intellectual honesty from somebody with an audience to lose. It is also the reason he is still read by people who believe none of it. He gave the other side its best possible case in his own book at his own expense. It is worth adding what he had at stake personally. His whole public position rested on the claim that suffering could be borne and could mean something. That was the argument of his fiction for 20 years, it was the argument of his journalism, and it was what his readers came to him for. He was the writer who had been sentenced to death and sent to Siberia and had come back believing, and then his son died of an illness he thought he had given him, and he sat down and wrote the strongest case against his own position that anybody had written. He did not have to. Nobody would have noticed if the reply had been easier and the objection weaker. He made it as hard as he could. It is worth adding what he did with the risk in practice. He controlled the order. Ivan's chapter came first, in one installment, and then readers had to wait a month for the reply. That was not accidental. The serial form meant every reader in Russia spent 4 weeks holding the objection with nothing set against it. He could have arranged it differently. He could have run them together, or given the reply first, or softened the interval. He let it stand alone for a month, which is either a serious miscalculation or the most confident thing he ever did, and given how carefully he wrote to his editor about the sequencing, it was not a miscalculation. Chapter 12. What he answered with, and the 2 months he had left. And what he answered with is the thing I would most like you to take from tonight." He did not write a rebuttal. The next section of the book is not an argument. It is a portrait. The life of the elder Zosima, his history, his brother who died young, the events that turned him, and his teaching, which is mostly about practical love and about being responsible to everybody for everything. There is no premise anywhere in it that answers Ivan's logic. Ivan's argument is still standing at the end of the book. It is still standing now. What Dostoevsky put next to it was a person. His claim, if he has one, is not that the suffering of children can be justified. He never says that, and he does not believe it. His claim is that there is a way of living that is available anyway in the presence of an unanswered question, and that it looks like a particular old man doing small things for a queue of people. He set an argument against a life and declined to pretend the argument had been beaten. He finished the novel in November 1880. He died on the 28th of January 1881 at 59 of a pulmonary hemorrhage, 10 weeks. Anna was 34. She lived another 37 years, published him, catalogued him, and never remarried. The grain of wheat is on the stone. It is worth adding what his editor made of it, because the correspondence is unusually revealing. He wrote to Lyubimov about both halves. About the Ivan material, he was almost boastful. He thought it was the strongest thing he had done. And about the answer, coming in the following installment, he was anxious in a way that is unlike him. He described it as the reply to the whole negative side, and said it would need to be adequate, and worried in writing about whether it would be. A confident man does not write that letter. He knew he was attempting something that might not work, in public, one installment at a time, with the strong side already printed and unretractable. It is worth adding what happened to the two halves in reception. Ivan won, not with the author and not in the structure of the book, but in the culture. The Grand Inquisitor and the Rebellion chapter are anthologized, taught, and quoted constantly. Zosima's book is skipped by a large proportion of readers and is generally considered the weakest section. He would have hated that, and it is not surprising. An argument is portable. A portrait of a life is not, and cannot be excerpted, and does not survive being summarized. Which means the balance he constructed with such care does not survive contact with how books actually get read. It is worth adding one further thing about how the two halves were received in his own lifetime. He was pleased with Zosima. He wrote about it with satisfaction and thought the answer had landed, which most later readers do not think. That gap between what an author believes they have achieved and what readers find is worth noticing on its own account. He was closer to it than anybody, and he was, on the general verdict of a century and a half, wrong about which half of his own book was stronger. Nobody has a reliable view of their own work. It is one of the few things about writing that is genuinely settled. It is worth adding one more thing about what he thought he had done, because there is a late document that complicates it. In his notebooks from the last year, there are drafts responding to critics who had said exactly what readers have said ever since, that Ivan was too strong and Zosima too weak. He was stung. He argued back. He insisted that the reply was there and that people were not reading properly, which is either an author defending a book that works better than critics allow, or a man unable to accept that the strongest thing he ever wrote was the case against everything he believed. Both readings have been argued seriously for a century, and I am not going to settle it in a recording made to help people sleep. Chapter 13. Now, the other half, and where the 5 stages came from. That is the story. From here to the end, we look at what is actually known, and I want to say at the outset that this is one of the areas where the gap between what the research says and what everybody believes is at its widest. Almost everything the culture holds about grief was established before it was studied, has been examined since, and has not survived. That is unusually good news, because most of what people are lying awake feeling bad about is compliance with a model that does not exist. Start with the stages, because it is the single most widely believed idea in this field, and it is a misunderstanding from top to bottom. In 1969, a Swiss-American psychiatrist called Elisabeth Kubler-Ross published a book called On Death and Dying. What she had done was genuinely important. In American hospitals at that time, dying patients were routinely not told they were dying. It was considered kinder. Nobody talked to them. She did something almost nobody had done, which was to sit with dying patients in numbers and ask them what it was like. That was the work. It was compassionate, and it changed hospital practice, and she deserves the credit for it. And in the course of describing what she heard, she set out 5 things she had observed: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, 2 facts about that list, both of which are usually missed, and either of which, on its own, dismantles the popular version. It is worth adding what she actually did that mattered, because it has been swamped by the model. She got dying people talked to. In American hospitals in the 1960s, terminal patients were routinely not told they were dying. Families colluded, doctors thought it was kinder. The result was that people died in a conspiracy of cheerfulness, unable to say anything true to anybody. She went in, sat down, and asked them what it was like, and then she got medical students to come and listen. That changed practice, and it changed it permanently, and it is the reason anybody knows her name. The 5 stages are a byproduct that escaped and became something she spent the rest of her life qualifying. It is worth adding one more piece of context about 1969. She was working against her own profession. Hospitals resisted. Physicians told her there were no dying patients on their wards, which was not true. She had to find them by asking nurses. That is worth remembering when the stages are criticized, including by me. The criticism is only possible because she did the thing nobody else would do, which was to sit down next to people everybody else was avoiding and take notes. The model is wrong. The work was necessary, and the fact that a flawed byproduct of it became famous is not really her failure. It is worth adding one more thing about what she was working against. Nobody had asked the patients anything. That is the fact that is easy to skim past. There was a large literature on death and dying, produced by physicians and clergy and philosophers, and essentially none of it contained what dying people said when asked. Her contribution was methodological before it was theoretical. She treated the person in the bed as the source. That is now so obvious that it is invisible. It was not obvious in 1965, and there are areas of medicine and of policy where it is still not. It is worth adding what happened to her afterwards, because it bears on how the model spread. She became enormously famous very fast. The book sold in millions. She was on television, on lecture circuits, in magazines. And the 5 stages traveled far beyond anything she had claimed, into management training and self-help, and eventually into schools. Her later career went in directions that a great many colleagues found difficult, and the debate about that is not mine to have here. What matters for tonight is only this. The model that has caused so much unnecessary guilt spread on the strength of celebrity, not evidence, and it was already out of her hands within a few years. Chapter 14. Who she was actually studying. The first fact is that the patients were dying. The 5 stages are a description of what she observed in people coming to terms with their own approaching death. They are not a description of bereavement. She was not studying people who had lost somebody. That population is not in the book in any systematic way. So, the model that half the Western world applies to the death of a parent or a partner or a child was derived from interviews with a completely different group of people facing a completely different situation. The second fact is that she said herself, repeatedly and in print, that they were never intended as a linear sequence, that not everybody experiences all of them, that they can come in any order, and that they can recur. She was clear about this. In a later book she wrote, with David Kessler, that the stages were never meant to tuck messy emotions into neat packages, and that they are not stops on a linear timeline. The staircase was not hers. It was built by everybody else out of a list she had written down. It is worth adding one more thing about the mismatch. Even for the population she was studying, the model was descriptive rather than prescriptive. She was reporting what she had heard from people facing their own deaths. That some denied it, some were furious, some bargained, some were flattened, and some arrived at something like peace. That is a list of things that happen. It is not a sequence. It does not claim everybody has all of them, and it certainly does not say that anybody ought to. The staircase was built afterwards by other people for reasons that had a great deal to do with wanting a diagram. It is worth adding what she said about it later in as many words. She wrote that the stages were never meant to be a way of tucking messy emotions into neat packages, that they are not stops on a linear timeline, and that not everybody goes through all of them or in any order. That is in print from her, decades before the model became universal in its distorted form. So the thing that has caused so much unnecessary guilt is not a theory that failed. It is a list that escaped, was simplified by other people into a staircase, and then became so useful to institutions that no amount of correction from its author could pull it back. It is worth adding what actually replaced the stage model in clinical practice: nothing tidy. Which is why the stages survive. There is no diagram. There is a set of findings about trajectories, a model about oscillation, a body of work on bonds, and a diagnostic category for a minority. None of that fits on a poster, and none of it tells a person what happens next, which is what everybody wants. The stages persist because they answer a question that the evidence cannot answer, and an answer that is wrong will beat no answer at all almost every time. It is worth adding what the stage model does to people who did not love the person straightforwardly. It has no room for them at all. A very large number of bereavements are complicated. The parent who was cruel, the sibling you had not spoken to, the partner you were about to leave, the person whose death was partly a relief and entirely a loss at the same time. None of that fits a sequence that runs from denial to acceptance, because the thing to be accepted is not a single fact. And those are precisely the bereavements people find hardest to talk about, because the available vocabulary assumes a clean loss, and there is no polite way to say that you are grieving somebody you did not like. One more thing about complicated bereavements, and it is the one people carry longest. Relief is not a disqualification. A very large number of deaths bring relief with them, and the relief is usually accurate. An illness has ended, or a long ordeal is over, or a difficult person is no longer in the room. And almost nobody says so, because relief at a death is the one response the culture has no place for at all. So people carry it privately, alongside the grief, and treat it as evidence that they did not love the person properly, when in fact the two arrive together in most long illnesses and in most difficult relationships, and their coexistence is entirely ordinary. Chapter 15. Why it stuck, and what believing it costs. So, why is it everywhere? Because it does something enormously useful for everybody except the bereaved person. It converts an open-ended, unpredictable, frightening state into a process with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It gives a doctor something to say. It gives a friend a way to place you. It tells an employer roughly how long, and it reassures everybody in the room that there is a track and that you are somewhere on it and that it terminates. The empirical support for it as a stage sequence is poor. The one prominent attempt to test the ordering in a bereaved sample found a pattern that its authors read as partly consistent, and the study was criticized heavily on its measures and its sample, and the field has not adopted it. The current position in the research literature is that grief does not proceed in stages, that individual trajectories vary enormously, and that the stage model is not used as a clinical framework by people who work in this area. I labor this because the belief does specific damage, and if you recognize any of the following, it is worth knowing where it came from. It produces the conviction that you are behind. If there is a sequence, you can be at the wrong point in it. It produces the conviction that you skipped one. People genuinely worry out loud that they were never angry and wonder whether the anger is stored somewhere waiting. It produces the belief that there is a terminus called acceptance, after which this is over, and that if you are still crying in a supermarket 4 years later, then something has gone wrong. And it produces a timetable in everybody around you, which is the cruelest part, because at some point, usually much sooner than you expect, people begin to behave as though the subject is closed. None of that is supported by anything. There is no schedule, you are not behind, there is no stage you failed to complete. It is worth adding what the belief does to the people around a bereaved person, because that is where a lot of the damage lands. It gives them a timetable. If there are stages and they conclude, then there is a point at which the subject is finished, and after that point mentioning it becomes awkward. So people stop asking. They stop saying the name. They assume that raising it would be reopening something, and the bereaved person, who wanted more than anything to be asked, concludes that everybody has moved on, and that continuing to feel this way is an embarrassment. That is one of the most common and most avoidable injuries in this whole area, and it is caused almost entirely by a model that nobody involved has examined. It is worth adding one more cost of the staircase, and it is the one that bites decades later. It tells people that grief is an episode, something with a beginning and an end, which happens after a death, and which is then over, after which you are a person who has been bereaved rather than a person who is, which leaves no room at all for the ordinary experience of finding at 70 that something about a parent who died when you were 30 has arrived again with full force for no reason in a car park. That is not a relapse. There is nothing to relapse into. It is simply what carrying somebody looks like over a whole life, and the episode model has no place to put it. It is worth adding one more cost of the model, and it lands on the same people every time. It has no room for grief that started before the death. The person who cared for a parent through 8 years of dementia has been grieving for most of a decade by the time the death occurs, and everybody around them starts the clock on the day of the funeral. So they are treated as being in week 1 when they are in year 8, and their comparative composure is read as denial, and the exhaustion that follows is read as delayed grief. That is one of the more common and more avoidable misreadings in this whole area, and it follows directly from a model in which grief is an episode that begins at a death. Chapter 16. The paper that said so, in 1989. In 1989, Camille Wortmann and Roxanne Cohen-Silver published a paper called The Myths of Coping with Loss. They went through what was then the received clinical wisdom and asked in each case what the actual evidence was. Their conclusions were, at the time, close to heretical, and they have largely held up. The first myth, that intense distress or depression is inevitable after a major loss. In fact, a substantial proportion of bereaved people never experience intense distress, and follow-up shows they are not concealing anything. The second myth, that failure to experience distress indicates pathology. This was the clinical orthodoxy. Absence of grief meant it was being suppressed and would emerge later worse. The longitudinal data does not support it. The people who did not have an intense reaction largely continued not to and did well. The third myth, that it is necessary to work through a loss, and that people who avoid confronting it will suffer later. The evidence is mixed at best, and in some studies those who worked through it most intensively did no better. The fourth myth, that everybody recovers and reaches a resolution. Many people do not, in the sense the model means, and continue to experience distress and to think about the loss frequently for many years, and are otherwise functioning perfectly well. That last one deserves to be said again in plain language. Never getting over it is not a failure state. It is one of the ordinary outcomes, it is compatible with a good life, and it is what a large number of people do. It is worth adding one more myth from that paper, because it is the one that produces the most guilt. The myth that you must let go in order to recover. That was the clinical orthodoxy for most of the 20th century, and it is the origin of every piece of advice about moving on, putting the photographs away, and not dwelling. The evidence for it was never good. The evidence against it, which we come to shortly, is now substantial. But it was in the air for decades, and it is still in the air, and a very large number of people are quietly carrying the belief that their continued attachment to somebody who died is a failure of some necessary work. It is worth adding what Wortman and Silver were up against. They were not arguing with folklore, they were arguing with the clinical consensus. The four myths they identified were, at the time, what practitioners were taught: that distress is inevitable, that its absence is pathological, that working through is necessary, and that recovery and resolution are the normal endpoint. Publishing a paper saying that the evidence for all four was poor was not a safe thing to do in 1989, and the position they took has largely held up over 35 years, which is a reasonable reminder that the confident consensus in an area with weak data is very often simply wrong, and that this is worth remembering the next time somebody tells you with great authority how grief works. It is worth adding what has happened to those findings since 1989. They have broadly held. The resilience trajectory work, the absence of a universal stage sequence, the poor evidence for compulsory working through, and the fact that many people do not reach anything that looks like resolution, all of that has been strengthened rather than overturned by 35 years of better designs, which is unusual. A great deal of psychology from that period has not survived, and it is worth saying when something has. It is worth adding one more of their conclusions, because it is the one that most directly contradicts what people are told. There is no reliable evidence that expressing grief more produces better outcomes than expressing it less. That runs against the entire folk model, in which bottling it up is dangerous and letting it out is healthy, and in which people who do not cry are storing something. The picture from the research is that people differ enormously, that both styles are compatible with doing well, and that being pushed toward the style that is not yours is unhelpful in either direction. Which means that if you are somebody who has not cried much and has been told repeatedly that you need to, there is no evidence behind the instruction. Chapter 17. The model that replaced the staircase and oscillation. So, What does the field actually use? The most influential framework is the dual process model, published by Margaret Strobey and Henk Schutt in 1999. It is not a stage model, and it does not have an endpoint, and once you have it, you will recognize your own experience in it immediately. Their observation is that bereaved people are dealing with two different kinds of demand, not one. The first they call loss-oriented. This is the grief itself. Thinking about the person, going over what happened, missing them, looking at photographs, crying, the whole business of the absence. The second they call restoration-oriented. This is everything else the death produced, the practical apparatus of a changed life. Learning to do things they did, dealing with the paperwork, managing a household differently, being a different person at work, reconstructing a daily routine that was built around somebody who is not there. Both are grief. That is the first correction. The restoration side is not a distraction from grieving. It is half the work. And then the central claim, which is the one worth having. Healthy grieving is not doing one and then the other. It is not a sequence. It is oscillation between the two. A person moves back and forth, sometimes over weeks, sometimes over minutes, into the loss, out of it, and into the practical, back into the loss. And Strobey and Schutt's argument is that the oscillation is not a symptom of instability, it is the mechanism, it is how the thing is processed. The reason it has to alternate is that neither side can be sustained. Full immersion in the loss is not survivable for long, and full avoidance does not work either, and the demands accumulate. So the system does what a system does with an overwhelming input. It takes it in doses. It is worth adding why the restoration side counts as grief and not as avoidance, because the distinction is genuinely hard. The test is not what you are doing, it is whether you are able to go back. A person who is dealing with the practical business of a changed life and can also, at other times, be in the loss, is oscillating. A person who is dealing with the practical business specifically in order never to be in the loss and who cannot stop is doing something else. The first is the mechanism. The second is a strategy that works for a while and then does not. And the honest position is that they look identical from outside and are often hard to tell apart from inside, which is why the useful question is not am I avoiding, but can I still get back in when I let myself? It is worth adding why the model was needed at all, because the previous one had no room for the practical side. Under the older account, dealing with the paperwork and learning to cook and reorganizing the week were not grief. They were at best distraction and at worst avoidance of the real work, which left a very large number of people, mostly the ones who had to keep a household running, being told that the thing occupying 9/10 of their attention was not the thing they were supposed to be doing. The dual process model simply said, that is half of it, which sounds obvious and was not, and it relieved an enormous amount of unnecessary guilt in one move. It is worth adding one practical consequence of the oscillation model that nobody tells bereaved people. You are allowed to schedule it. Some people find that setting a time to go into the lost deliberately, rather than waiting to be ambushed, changes the character of the whole thing. Half an hour with the photographs on a Sunday on purpose. That sounds cold and is reported by a surprising number of people as the thing that helped most, because an ambush is unbearable and an appointment is survivable, which is a finding we met earlier tonight in an entirely different context. It also gives you something true to say to yourself at 3 in the morning. Not now, we do this on Sunday. Chapter 18, which explains the supermarket. Take that back to your own experience. You have a good morning. You are functioning. You are dealing with things. You are almost light. And then something small and stupid, a coat, a song, a smell in a shop, and you are on the floor. Under the staircase model, that is regression, and it means you were not as far along as you thought. Under the dual process model, that is the system working exactly as designed. You have been in restoration mode for 6 hours, and the lost side has been waiting, and it takes its turn, and the trigger is only the doorway. And the guilt goes the other way too, and this is the one nobody says. There are hours, quite early, when you are fine, when you laugh at something, when you are absorbed in a piece of work and have not thought about them all afternoon. And then you notice, and there is a wave of something that feels like betrayal. That is also the mechanism. That hour is not a failure of love. It is the other half of the process, and without it, you would not survive the first half. You are not unstable. You are oscillating, and the oscillation is the thing that carries people through. It is worth adding one more thing that oscillation explains, and it is the one that frightens people most: the forgetting. There is a moment, usually somewhere in the first year, when you realize you have not thought about them for several hours. And then a much worse moment, later, when you cannot immediately remember the exact sound of their voice. People experience that as a betrayal and as evidence that they are losing the person a second time. It is neither. It is the ordinary behavior of memory which does not maintain sensory detail without rehearsal, and it happens to everybody, and it has no relationship whatsoever to how much the person mattered. It is worth adding what the oscillation looks like over years rather than days. The period lengthens. In the first weeks, it can be minute to minute. Later it is hours, then days, then something more like seasons, a stretch of months in which the loss is quiet, and then a fortnight in which it is not, often attached to nothing identifiable. And people who have not been told about the pattern read the quiet months as recovery and the returning fortnight as collapse. It is neither. It is the same oscillation running at a longer wavelength, which is what it does as the years accumulate. It is worth adding what oscillation implies for advice. Almost all standard advice pushes people toward one side. Talk about it, do not bottle it up, keep the memory alive. That is all loss-oriented. And it is what most people are told. Keep busy, get back to normal, do not dwell. That is all restoration-oriented, and it is what the same people are told by different friends, often in the same week. Both are half right, both are useless as general instructions, and the model says the thing that matters is the movement between them rather than the position. It is worth adding what oscillation looks like when it stops. Both failure modes exist and they look nothing alike. Somebody stuck on the lost side is recognizable. It is what everybody pictures when they think about grief going wrong, and it is what the diagnostic category is aimed at. Somebody stuck on the restoration side is not recognizable at all. They look excellent. They are busy, functional, back at work early, organizing everybody, and frequently praised for how well they are doing. That second one is far more common and almost never identified, and it tends to surface 18 months to 3 years later as exhaustion or as illness or as an inexplicable collapse over something small. One more thing about the two failure modes, and it is for the people around somebody rather than for the person themselves. The one you should worry about is the one who looks best. Somebody visibly struggling is visible, and people gather and services eventually get involved. Somebody who returned to work in a fortnight, who organized the funeral beautifully and who has been checking on everybody else, is receiving congratulations. That second person is very often the one who has not been able to go into it at all and who has no plan to, and who will find out somewhere in the third year that it has been waiting. If you know one of those, they are the one to ask. And they will say they are fine and you should ask again in a month. Chapter 19. Where the old model came from. The idea that you are supposed to detach has a specific origin, and it is worth naming, because a great many people are laboring under a theory from 1917 without knowing it. In Mourning and Melancholia, Freud proposed that the work of mourning consists of gradually withdrawing attachment from the person who has died, memory by memory, until the attachment is free and can be reinvested elsewhere. Successful mourning, on that account, ends with detachment. That became the dominant framework for most of the 20th century, and it produced the practical advice everybody has heard. Let go, move on, do not dwell, put the photographs away. And it is worth knowing that Freud himself, in private, did not appear to believe it. In 1929, his friend Ludwig Binswanger lost a son. Freud wrote to him. And what he wrote is almost the opposite of his own theory, that although acute mourning subsides, we remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute, that whatever fills the gap, even if it fills it completely, remains something else, and that this is how it should be, because it is the only way of perpetuating a love we do not wish to relinquish. His own daughter Sophie had died in 1920 and his grandson in 1923. The theory said, detach. The letter said, we do not and should not. It is worth adding what Freud was actually doing in that paper, because it is usually read as a piece of coldness, and it was not. He was writing in 1917 in the middle of a war that was producing bereavement on a scale nobody had instruments for, and he was trying to distinguish two things that looked alike: ordinary mourning, which resolves, and melancholia, which does not. That was a genuinely useful distinction, and a version of it survives today. The part that did not survive is the mechanism he proposed for the first one, that mourning consists of withdrawing attachment, memory by memory, until the tie is dissolved and the energy is free. He was reasoning from a model of the mind as a closed hydraulic system with a fixed quantity of energy in it, and that model is gone, and the clinical advice that came out of it outlived it by 70 years. It is worth adding what Freud's own practice looked like against his theory. He kept a photograph of his daughter Sophie on his desk and wore a locket with her picture in it for the rest of his life. Sophie died in 1920 at 26 in the influenza pandemic. Her son Heinrich died 3 years later at 4.5, and Freud said afterwards that he had never been able to grieve for anybody else since, and that it was the only time in his life he had wept. He wrote to friends that he had lost the capacity to enjoy life and that this was permanent. So the man whose theory said the work of mourning ends in detachment did not detach, said he could not, and did not appear to think he should. It is worth adding why the older model was so persuasive despite the evidence. It described something real. There are people for whom an attachment does need to loosen before they can function, and clinicians see them, and the model was built by somebody seeing them. The error was generalizing from the clinic to the population, which is the same error we met earlier tonight with voice hearing, and which recurs in almost every area of mental health. Practitioners see the people for whom something is going badly. That is not a criticism of practitioners. It is a structural fact about where their sample comes from. It is worth adding one more thing about the paper and its afterlife. The detachment model has still not entirely gone. It survives in ordinary speech, in the language of closure and moving on and letting go, and it survives in the expectations of employers and institutions and sometimes of families. Which means a bereaved person today is very likely to be operating under a theory from 1917 without ever having heard of it, and to be judging themselves against a standard that the field abandoned 30 years ago. That gap between what is known and what is believed is wider in this area than in almost anything else I have looked at. And closing it is most of what an evening like this can usefully do. Chapter 20. Continuing Bonds. In 1996, Dennis Klass, Phyllis Silverman, and Stephen Nickman published a book called Continuing Bonds that overturned the detachment model in the field. Their argument, built from a range of studies including work with bereaved parents and with children who had lost a parent, was that the ongoing relationship with the person who has died is normal, extremely common, and in many cases, adaptive. People talk to them, they ask them things, they keep objects and use them, they notice what the person would have said, they mark anniversaries, they feel accompanied, they consult them about decisions. Under the old model, all of that was failure to complete the work. Under the current understanding, it is what most bereaved people do across cultures, and it is not associated with worse outcomes. In many contexts, it is associated with better ones. There is a nuance the researchers are careful about. Bonds that involve distress about the reality of the death or that are being used to avoid it can go with poorer adjustment. It is not that every form is helpful, but the default assumption that maintaining a relationship with the dead is pathological was simply wrong and it was wrong in a way that made a great many people feel they were failing at something they were in fact doing correctly. It is worth adding what the continuing bonds researchers found people actually doing, because the list is very ordinary. Talking to them out loud in the car. Keeping and using objects. A coat, a tool, a mug, a pen. Not shrines, things in daily use. Asking them what they would have thought and getting an answer in their voice with their particular turn of phrase. Marking dates, visiting places, naming children, consulting them about decisions, and knowing perfectly well what they would have said, which is a form of knowledge that survives the person entirely intact. None of that is unusual. All of it was classified as failure to complete the work, and it is what a large majority of bereaved people across every culture that has been studied simply do. It is worth adding what happens when somebody is told the bond is pathological. They hide it. That is the practical consequence, and it is well documented. People who talk to somebody who died, or keep a room, or set a place, learn very quickly that these are things you do not mention, and so they continue doing them privately and add secrecy to grief, which removes the one thing that might have helped, which is discovering that almost everybody else does it too. The continuing bonds work did not give people permission to do something new. It gave them permission to say out loud something they were already doing and had been quietly ashamed of. It is worth adding one specific and very common form of the bond that people are ashamed of: keeping the phone number, not calling it. Keeping it in the contacts, sometimes for years, sometimes after it has been reassigned to a stranger. Almost everybody does some version of this, and almost nobody mentions it. And the ones who do usually preface it by saying they know it is silly. It is not silly, it is one of the most commonly reported behaviors in the whole literature. And the only thing that makes it painful is the belief that other people have deleted theirs. It is worth adding what the continuing bonds finding did in practice. It changed what practitioners say in the room. Before, the implicit goal of bereavement work was often detachment, and clients were being gently steered toward relinquishing. After, the goal became something more like relocation, finding a place for the person that is compatible with a continuing life. That is a completely different conversation, and it has a completely different feel. And people who were in bereavement counseling in the 1980s and again in the 2010s describe the two as barely the same activity. It is one of the clearer cases of research changing practice for the better within a working lifetime. Chapter 21. The chair at the table. Notice then what Dostoevsky did, and notice that it is a textbook continuing bond. He took his son's name and his son's age, and he put them into a book, into the mouth of an invented woman, and he gave that woman the consolation he had been given. The boy is in the novel. The hero is named for him. The epigraph is on the gravestone. He did not detach. He built something that would carry the name, and he worked on it for 2.5 years, and then he died. That is not a failure to mourn. On the modern account, it is one of the most complete pieces of grief work anybody has ever done, and it produced a novel that 145 years of people have used. And it is available in a much smaller form to anybody. The bond does not require a masterpiece. It requires an object, a practice, a place, a phrase, a day in the year, something that carries the name forward without pretending the person is here. It is worth adding one honest qualification about continuing bonds, because the literature is more careful than the slogan. Not every form of it is helpful. The distinction that comes out of the research is roughly between bonds that incorporate the death and bonds that do not. Talking to somebody you know is dead is one thing. Maintaining a relationship that requires you not to have absorbed that they are dead is another, and the second is associated with worse outcomes. That is not a bright line, and clinicians disagree about where it sits. But the default assumption has flipped completely, and that is the thing to take. The question is no longer, why have you not let go? It is, what kind of bond do you have? And is it one you can live inside? It is worth adding how the bond changes over time, because it does. It generally becomes less like a presence and more like a perspective. Early on, the reports are often sensory, hearing them on the stairs, catching a glimpse, feeling them in the room. Those experiences are extremely common in the first year, are not a symptom of anything, and frighten people who have never been told how ordinary they are. Later, that mostly settles into something quieter, knowing what they would have said, carrying a standard they set, noticing a thing they would have liked. Neither stage is more advanced than the other, but people who are not warned about the first one often think they are losing their minds, and people who reach the second one often think they are losing the person. It is worth adding what the bond does that nothing else does. It keeps the person in the present tense of your life rather than in its history, which matters because the alternative on offer is that they recede into the past and become somebody you used to know, and a great many bereaved people find that prospect far more frightening than the grief itself. The fear is not of feeling bad forever. It is of eventually not feeling much at all, and of that being called recovery. Continuing bonds is, among other things, the finding that this is not the required destination. One more note on how the bond is usually described by people who have it: they rarely call it a relationship. Asked directly, most people will say something more cautious, that they talk to them sometimes, or that they know what they would have said, or that they still catch themselves reaching for the phone. The hedging is the interesting part. It is what a person does with something they value and have been given no permission to have. That hedging is the thing the research removed, and removing it is worth more than any technique. Chapter 22. When it is a condition, and the argument against, now the honest and difficult chapter, because there is a real argument in this field, and you deserve both sides of it. In the last 25 years, a body of work associated particularly with Holly Priggerson and colleagues has established that a minority of bereaved people, commonly estimated somewhere around 1 in 10, experience something that does not look like ordinary grief. The picture is a persistent, intense yearning and preoccupation, lasting well beyond the expected period for the person's culture, together with substantial impairment, not working, not eating, not seeing anybody, life organized entirely around the loss, often with a sense that part of oneself has died. The argument for naming it is straightforward. These people are suffering enormously. They are identifiable. Treatments developed specifically for the condition work considerably better than general depression treatment, and without a name they do not get referred and do not get the treatment. It entered the international classification in 2018 as prolonged grief disorder and the American Diagnostic Manual in 2022. The objection is serious, and it has been made by serious people, including clinicians who work with the bereaved. The concern is that you have taken love and put a duration on it, that the criteria threaten to turn an ordinary and profound human response into a disorder if it lasts longer than a specified number of months. That grief varies enormously by culture and by relationship, and that a fixed threshold cannot possibly accommodate that. That it opens the door to medicating something that is not an illness. Both sides are arguing in good faith, and both are pointing at something real. Where it lands, as far as I can tell, is roughly this. The criteria are deliberately built around impairment rather than intensity. It is not about how much it hurts or how long. It is about whether your life has stopped, whether you are functioning, eating, sleeping, seeing anybody, doing any of the things you used to do, which gives you a usable line, and it is not a line about the size of your grief. Grief that hurts enormously years later and comes in waves and never fully goes and sits alongside a life that is otherwise running is not a disorder. It is what a great many people carry. Grief that has stopped the life and kept it stopped is a thing that responds to specific help, and the help exists, and the outcomes are good. It is worth adding the specific numbers, because vagueness helps nobody here. The estimates for prolonged grief in the bereaved population generally run somewhere around 7 to 10%, higher after certain kinds of loss, and considerably higher after the death of a child. Which means two things at once, and both matter. It is a minority. The overwhelming majority of bereaved people, including people whose grief is enormous and lasting, do not have this and do not need treatment for it. And it is not a small minority. 7 to 10% of the bereaved is a very large number of people. And before 2018, almost none of them had a name for what was happening or a route to the treatment that helps. It is worth adding what the disagreement is really about, because it is not really about grief. It is about what a diagnosis is for. One camp holds that a diagnosis is a tool. It opens doors, funds services, directs research, and gets people the specific treatment that works. On that view, refusing to name something because the name is uncomfortable leaves people untreated for the sake of a principle. The other holds that a diagnosis is also a claim about what is normal, that the claim travels far beyond the clinic, and that once a duration is attached to grief in a manual, ordinary people will start measuring themselves against it, whether or not the criteria say they should. Both of those are true. That is why the argument has not resolved, and probably will not. It is worth adding the one thing both sides of that argument agree on. The people who have it are not getting help. Whatever you think about the criteria, the practical situation before 2018 was that a group of people with a severe, identifiable and treatable condition were being told either that grief takes as long as it takes, or that they had depression and should try an antidepressant, and neither was right. That is the case for the diagnosis, and it is a strong one, and it does not require you to be comfortable with the duration criteria. It only requires you to accept that a name is what unlocks a service, which is not a fact about grief. It is a fact about how health systems are built. It is worth adding what the criteria actually require, because the popular summary is misleading. It is not simply duration. The threshold in the diagnostic manuals combines a period of time with a specific symptom picture and, crucially, with impairment. The grief has to be interfering substantially with the person's ability to function. So, somebody grieving intensely at 3 years who is working and eating and seeing people does not meet it, however much it hurts. That distinction is the whole of the defense against the pathologizing objection, and it is the part that never survives into the newspaper version, which is always a headline about grief being classified as a disorder after a number of months. Chapter 23. The meaning question carefully, which brings us to the thing we started with. Robert Niemeyer has spent his career on what he calls meaning reconstruction, the idea that grief involves rebuilding a world of meaning that a death has broken, and that this process, rather than the withdrawal of attachment, is the central work. There is real support for it. Across studies, people who are able to make some sense of a loss tend to show better adjustment than those who are not, and the relationship is strong enough that it has been a major focus of the field. And now, the part that gets left out, and that I want you to have. A substantial proportion of bereaved people never find any sense in it at all. That is particularly true for the deaths that are hardest to accommodate. The deaths of children, sudden deaths, violent deaths, deaths that are nobody's fault and serve nothing. Those people are not failing at grief, and there is work suggesting that being pressed toward meaning by others or by oneself, when none is available, adds a burden rather than lifting one. You then have two problems: the loss and your failure to have transformed it. So the honest statement of what the evidence supports is narrower than the poster version. Finding a meaning when one is genuinely available to you helps. Manufacturing one does not. And the absence of one is not a symptom. It is worth adding what meaning reconstruction actually involves, because the phrase suggests something grander than the research describes. It is mostly narrative work, not finding a purpose. Building an account that hangs together. What happened, in what order, what it has changed, where the person sits now in your life rather than in your day. That is closer to editing than to philosophy. And it is the same finding that turns up in the writing literature and in the memory literature. What helps is structure, not intensity. which is worth knowing, because people asked to find meaning very often hear an instruction to justify and refuse it correctly, and in refusing it also refuse the much smaller thing that was actually on offer. It is worth adding one more finding about meaning that cuts against the intuition. Sense-making and benefit-finding are separate. Sense-making is understanding how it happened, the medical account, the sequence, why it could not have been prevented. Benefit-finding is identifying something good that came of it. The research generally finds that sense-making, where it is available, is associated with better adjustment. Benefit-finding is much weaker and in some studies is associated with worse. Which matters, because the pressure people are usually under is the second kind. Nobody at a funeral says, "I hope you eventually understand the mechanism." They say, "Something good will come of this." The first is the one with evidence behind it, and it is the one nobody offers. It is worth adding a small practical distinction that follows from that. You can ask for the sense-making, the medical account, the sequence of what happened, what was and was not possible, whether anything would have changed it. Bereaved people are very often too frightened of the answer to ask, and then carry an invented version for decades, which is almost always worse than the real one. Doctors will generally sit down and go through it years later if asked. Very few people know that this is available. It is worth adding what happens when a meaning does arrive, because it is worth knowing the shape. It is almost never about the death. People who report having found something rarely say that they now understand why it happened or that they can see what it was for. What they report instead is a change in what they do. Work taken up, a cause, a relationship attended to differently, time spent otherwise, which is meaning in the ordinary sense of the word rather than in the metaphysical one, and it is made rather than found, and it is made afterwards and slowly. Nobody in the research reports waking up one morning with the reason. Chapter 24, which is what he said. And this is why I wanted to spend the first half of tonight on him rather than on anybody else. Because he had every incentive to write the consoling version. He was religious. He had a monastery and an elder. He was the most famous writer in the country. His readers wanted comfort, and he knew it. And he wrote Ivan's List instead, and he made it as strong as he could, and he wrote to his editor saying he was worried his answer was not good enough. He did not solve it. He was not able to, and he was honest about not being able to, in public, in the most widely read book of his career, at the end of his life, about the death of his own child. That is what permission looks like. If the man who wrote the greatest religious novel in the language could not make the death of a 2-year-old mean anything, and said so, then you are not required to make yours mean anything either. It is worth adding what he did instead of answering one more time, because it is the whole architecture of the book. He answered a proposition with a biography. Ivan's chapter is an argument. The reply is the life of a man, where he came from, what he was like as a young officer, the duel he did not fight, his brother who died, and then a long section of his teaching which contains no counter-argument at all, you cannot refute a life. That is either a profound structural insight or a very elegant evasion, and serious readers have taken it both ways for a century and a half. What is not in dispute is that he knew what he was doing. He set them side by side deliberately and let the reader stand between them, which is where he was standing himself. It is worth adding what it cost him to leave the question open in public. He was attacked for it from both directions immediately. Religious readers thought Ivan's case had been given too much room and the reply too little. Radical readers took Ivan and discarded the rest, which is what he had predicted. And he had 2.5 years to live and never wrote the sequel he had planned, in which Alyosha's story was to continue and, some scholars think, resolve into something. So the book we have is the one where the question stays open, and it stays open partly because he died before he could close it, which is either a loss or the most appropriate possible ending. It is worth adding what the unfinished sequel tells us. He planned to continue Alyosha's story into a second novel set 13 years later, and there are notes and reports of conversations about it. Some of what is recorded suggests the plan involved Alyosha leaving the monastery and going out into the world, and there are versions in which it does not end well. So the reassuring reading of the book, in which faith quietly wins, may not have been where he was going at all. We do not know. He died 10 weeks after finishing the first one, and the question stayed open in the only book we have. It is worth adding the thing he wrote to a bereaved mother, because he did, and it survives. A woman wrote to him after reading the peasant woman passage, having lost a young son, and he replied, his answer does not offer her a meaning. It tells her not to be comforted, to weep, and to remember that the child is not gone from her. And it tells her something else, which is that this will go on for a long time and that she should not expect it to stop. That is a man who had done exactly this 2 years earlier, writing to a stranger and declining to give her the thing everybody else in her life was presumably giving her. Chapter 25. So what does help? Let me put the practical findings in one place, because they are unglamorous and they are what the evidence actually supports. Time helps, but not in the way the phrase suggests. It is not that it gets smaller, it is that the intervals lengthen and the waves get further apart, and the life around it grows. Oscillation helps, which means let yourself out of it as well as into it. The afternoon when you were absorbed in something and forgot is not a betrayal. It is the other half of the mechanism, and it is doing work. The bond helps. Keep them. Talk to them if you talk to them. Use the objects. Say the name out loud, which a startling number of families stop doing, and which the people who have lost somebody almost always want. Other people help, and specifically people who do not require you to be finished. One person who can sit with it and does not need it to resolve is worth more than a great many who need you to be better. And the practical side counts as grieving. The paperwork, the changed routine, learning the thing they used to do, that is not avoidance. That is half the process. It is worth adding one more item to that list, and it is the one people are least likely to have been told. Eat and sleep on a schedule you did not choose. That sounds trivial, and it is one of the better supported practical findings in the whole area. Bereavement disrupts appetite and sleep more reliably than almost anything else, and the disruption then amplifies everything: concentration, mood, physical health, the capacity to be with other people. Nobody can decide to feel better. Almost anybody can be handed a meal at a set time by somebody else. Which is why the most useful thing a friend can do in the first months is not conversation, it is arriving with food at intervals without asking whether it would help. It is worth adding the single most useful practical item, because it is the one people never think of as grief work. Learn the thing they did, whatever it was. The accounts, the car, the cooking, the family birthdays, the boiler. The task that was theirs and is now nobody's. That is restoration-oriented work in the technical sense. It is half of the mechanism, and it is also the thing most likely to produce the sudden collapse in a hallway, because it puts you directly in contact with the absence in a practical rather than an emotional register. People often avoid those tasks for months and then find that doing one of them is the hardest afternoon and also the one after which something shifts. It is worth adding one more item to the list, and it is the one that helps soonest. Other bereaved people. Not as therapy, simply proximity to people who have the same thing and do not need it explained, and in whose company you do not have to manage anybody's discomfort. The evidence for formal support groups is mixed and depends heavily on the group. The evidence for the underlying mechanism, being with people who do not require you to be finished, is much more consistent. For bereaved parents specifically, that is the single most commonly reported source of help in the qualitative literature, and it is usually found late and by accident. It is worth adding one more item, and it is the one people are most surprised to be told: do less. There is a persistent belief that grief must be worked at, and that a person who is not actively processing is wasting time and storing up trouble. The evidence does not support it. Most people recover ordinary functioning without doing anything that anybody would call grief work, and the interventions that help are aimed at the minority who are stuck rather than at everybody. Which means that if you are getting through the days and have not read a book about it, or joined anything, or made any effort to process, you are not neglecting something. You are in the majority, and the majority is fine. And one more, which costs nothing and is almost never suggested. Ask somebody else what they remember. Not to compare notes on the death. To ask a sibling or an old friend of theirs or a colleague what the person was like in a period you were not there for. People come back with things you did not have, a story from before you were born, an opinion they held at 30, something they were famous for at work. That is new material about somebody you had assumed was a closed set, and there is very little else in bereavement that can honestly be described as a gain. Chapter 26. What not to do to somebody else. A short chapter, because most people listening will at some point be the other person in the room, and the evidence on this is quite clear, and almost nobody follows it. Do not say everything happens for a reason. Do not say they are in a better place, unless you know for certain that the person believes it. Do not say at least. Not any at least, ever. Do not say, I know how you feel. Do not tell them, it is time. Do not avoid saying the name, and do not cross the road. And what to do instead is almost embarrassingly simple. And it is the thing the research on social support keeps returning to. Say the name. Say a specific thing you remember. Turn up. Turn up again 3 months later, when everybody else has stopped, and again on the anniversary, which people remember and never mention. Ambrose at Optina, receiving a queue of peasants for decades, was doing exactly that and nothing more sophisticated. He asked the woman her son's name. It is worth adding one more entry to the list of things not to say, because it is the most common of all, and it sounds harmless. Let me know if there is anything I can do. It transfers the work. It requires the bereaved person to identify a task, judge whether it is a reasonable imposition, and then make a request, which is 3 pieces of executive function at the precise moment when executive function is worst. Almost nobody ever calls. The alternative is to name the thing and give a time. I am coming on Thursday at 6 with dinner. I will take the bins out on Tuesday. I am going to the shop. I will be at yours in an hour. What do you need? A specific offer with a date can be declined in 1 word. An open offer cannot be accepted at all. It is worth adding the one thing that almost always helps and is almost never done. Say something specific about the person, not that they were wonderful. A specific thing, something they said, a way they laughed, an occasion, an opinion they held that you disagreed with. The reason it works is that it demonstrates something the bereaved person is desperate to know and cannot ask, which is that somebody else also holds the person, and that the whole weight of remembering is not resting on them alone. Almost every account by bereaved people of what actually helped contains a version of this, and almost every account of what people actually did contains casseroles and silence. It is worth adding one more thing not to say, because it is the most modern and the most damaging. Anything about being strong. You are being so strong. You are so brave. I do not know how you are coping. Those sound like compliments, and they function as instructions. They tell the person that composure is what is being admired, that it is what is expected, and that whatever is happening when nobody is watching should stay there. A very large number of bereaved people report that they stopped crying in front of people almost entirely after being told a few times how well they were doing. It is worth adding the one thing that is almost always safe to say. I do not know what to say. Said honestly, and then followed by staying in the room, that is better than every polished sentence in circulation. It does not pretend to understand. It does not offer a frame. It does not require the bereaved person to manage your discomfort or to reassure you that you have helped. It is also true, which is more than can be said for most of the alternatives, and bereaved people report it with gratitude far more often than anything else. Chapter 27. The Grain of Wheat. I want to come back to the epigraph, because it is easy to hear it as a promise, and I do not think that is what it is doing. The verse says that unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. read as a consolation that is offensive. It says, the death produced something, which is precisely the claim Ivan spends a whole chapter refusing and which Dostoevsky does not answer. But that is not the only reading available, and it is not the one the book supports. The book is about a dead child, and it is named for him, and it exists because he died. The grain in the epigraph is not the child. The grain is the book. Something did come out of it, and what came out of it was made by his father deliberately over 2.5 years at the desk while ill as an act. That is not a justification of the death. It is a thing a person did afterwards, which is a completely different category, and it is the only one available. It is worth adding what the epigraph does structurally, because it is doing more than decorating. It is the only claim in the book that is not put in somebody's mouth. Everything else is a character's. Ivan's argument, Zosima's teaching, Alyosha's faith, the narrator's uncertainty. The book is scrupulous about not adjudicating. The epigraph is unattributed to any character. It sits on the front before anybody has spoken, and it is the one place the author is present without a mask. And it is not an argument either. It is an image of a thing that has to be lost before anything comes of it, which is either the deepest available answer or the frankest possible admission that there is not one. It is worth adding what Anna did with the epigraph after he died. She had it carved on the stone. The verse is on his grave in the Tikhvin cemetery in Petersburg, where it can still be read, which is a decision by a widow of 34 about how to summarize a man, and she chose the sentence he had put on the front of the book he wrote after their son died. Whatever it meant to him, that is what it meant to her. Not a consolation about the child, but the thing her husband had chosen to stand in front of everything else, and which she then made permanent. It is worth adding what he thought the epigraph was doing. He never said. There is no letter explaining it and no note. He put it on the front and left it there. Which means every reading of it, including the one I gave, is a reader's reading. It has been taken as a promise of resurrection, as a statement about the novel's structure, as a claim about Russia, and as a private message about his son. All of those are available and none is authorized. He put 10 words on the front of a very long book and declined to gloss them, and then his wife had them cut into stone. It is worth adding one more reading of the epigraph that only appears if you know the biography. The seed in the verse is singular, not seeds. One grain falling into the ground alone, and the whole image turns on that solitude. Unless it dies, it abides alone. He chose it after burying a 2-year-old and put it in front of a book whose hero carries the child's name and said nothing about it for the rest of his life. I have deliberately given you 3 readings tonight and refused to choose between them, and I am going to keep refusing, because he did. Chapter 28, What is actually asked of you. So here is where the whole evening lands, and it is smaller than a meaning, and I think it is more useful. You are not required to make it mean something. You are not required to be finished, or to have stages, or to have grown, or to be able to say what it taught you at a dinner table. What is available, and what he did, and what the elder told the woman to do, is much more ordinary. Weep when it comes. Go home to the person who is also grieving. Keep the name. Do the practical things, which are also grief. Let yourself out of it sometimes, and do not call that betrayal. And, if you can, make something, however small, that carries it forward. That is all. That is the whole apparatus, and it is what the research supports, and it is what a monastery in a forest was telling peasant women in 1878. It is worth adding what the permission does not cover, because I do not want to be misread. Nothing tonight says you should not look for a meaning if one is available to you. Plenty of people find something, a faith they had already or one they arrive at, a change in how they spend their time, a cause taken up in a name. Those are real and they help, and I am not taking them off anybody. The permission is only this: if none of it has come, after however long, that is not a failure of effort, or of character, or of love. The evidence says a substantial minority never find one, that they are not doing worse than the people who did, and that being pushed toward one when it is not there makes things measurably harder. It is worth adding the sentence itself because it is the only instruction in the whole of tonight. You are allowed to be sad about it in a way that never becomes about anything. Not sad in a way that is teaching you something. Not sad in a way that is deepening you. Not sad in a way that will one day be revealed as having been necessary. Just sad, permanently, in a life that is otherwise perfectly functional, about something that should not have happened and did not need to happen and does not mean anything. That is a permitted outcome. It is a common one. And nothing in 35 years of research suggests that the people who reach it are doing worse than the people who found a meaning. It is worth adding what the permission is not one more time, because this is the point of the episode and I want it clean. It is not permission to give up. Nothing tonight suggests you should stop looking or stop talking about it or decide that it is meaningless and close the subject. People do arrive at something, sometimes very late, and the arriving is real when it happens. The permission is only against the deadline, against the belief that a meaning was due by now, that everybody else has one, and that failing to produce one is a further failure on top of the loss. There is no due date. That is the whole of it. It is worth adding the last version of the permission, and then we will start going down. You do not have to be doing this well. There is a modern expectation that even grief should be performed competently, that a person should be resilient, should be doing the work, should be growing, should be an example. None of that is required, and none of it is measured by anybody. You are allowed to be doing it badly, in whatever way you are doing it, without anybody's approval for as long as it takes, including forever. Chapter 29. The other person in the room and 2.5 years. One more thing about the story, and it is about Anna. Everything in tonight has been about a father, because he is the one who wrote it down. She lost the same child. She had lost one before, in Geneva, and in the weeks after Alyosha died, she was making arrangements for her husband's survival while carrying her own, and no part of the record suggests anybody was doing that for her. That is very common, and it is worth naming out loud. In almost every bereaved household, there is somebody who becomes the one who manages, and that person's grief happens in the gaps, late, alone, and gets no attention, including from themselves. If that is you, then this is the part of the recording that is for you. The management is not the grief. You are still owed the grief, and you have almost certainly not taken it. And the fact that you have been functioning is not evidence that you are fine. Think about what he did with the time he had left, because he did not know it was 2.5 years. He got up every day and wrote a very long book in monthly installments, with a printer waiting at 57 with epilepsy, in the aftermath of the worst thing that had happened to him. There is no evidence that it made him feel better. The letters do not say so. But it gave the days a shape, and it gave the loss somewhere to be, and at the end of it there was an object with the boy's name in it. That is not meaning. That is work done in the presence of something that had no meaning, which is a different and more achievable thing. It is worth adding what happens to the person who manages, because it has a shape and it is predictable. They are fine for about a year, and then they are not. The managing is genuinely sustaining while it lasts. There are calls to make and paperwork and other people to look after, and all of it is absorbing and none of it leaves room. And then it runs out. The estate is settled, the visitors stop, everybody else has resumed their lives, and the person who held it all together discovers that they have not started. They then frequently conclude that something is wrong with them, because everybody else appears to be further along, when in fact they simply began 18 months later than everybody else did. It is worth adding what to do if you are the one who managed. Assume you have not started, not as a criticism, as a working hypothesis, because it is true far more often than not, and because the alternative assumption that you must be fine since it has been 3 years is the one that keeps people from getting anything. The practical version is to find one person who is not in the household and who does not need you to be all right, and to say one true sentence to them about your own grief, rather than about the management of everybody else's. That is the whole intervention. Most people who have been in that role have never once done it. It is worth adding what to do if the person who managed is somebody else. Notice which one it is, and go to them. In almost every bereaved household, there is one person who became the organizer, and everybody, including them, has been treating their competence as evidence that they are the one who needs least. They are usually the one who has had the least room to grieve and who will be last to ask for anything. A specific offer to that person 6 months later is one of the highest value things anybody can do, and it will almost certainly be the first one they have received. Chapter 30. The arithmetic nobody mentions. There is a private calculation that bereaved people do and almost never say out loud, and I want to name it so that you know it is universal. You know how old they would be. Not approximately. Exactly. You know the birthday, and you know what year it would be, and you have run the number, probably more than once, probably recently. And attached to the number, there is a whole parallel life that assembles itself without being asked what they would be doing now, whether they would have married, what they would have made of a thing that happened last year, what they would have said about you. Alyosha Dostoevsky would have been 5 when his father died. He would have been 22 in 1897. People who have not been through it find that calculation morbid. It is not. It is what a mind does with a relationship that has been interrupted rather than concluded, and it is a form of the continuing bond, and it is not a symptom of anything. The only part of it that does damage is the belief that you should not be doing it. So, everybody does it, it is normal, and it goes on for decades. And it can sit perfectly well alongside a life that is otherwise entirely fine. It is worth adding what that arithmetic does over a long enough period. At some point, the parallel life becomes impossible to picture. For a child who died young, the imagined 20-year-old can be assembled from the 2-year-old with some effort. The imagined 40-year-old cannot. There comes a point where the person you are keeping track of has no available face. People find that stage particularly hard and are rarely warned about it because it arrives decades in, long after everybody has assumed the matter is settled. It is also, for some people, the point at which something eases, because the arithmetic finally stops producing a person and starts producing only a date. It is worth adding what people do with the number when it becomes unbearable. Some stop counting deliberately and find it helps. Others keep it and find that helps. There is no finding either way, no research to speak of, and no correct practice. It is one of the areas where the honest answer is that people do whatever they do, and none of it is a symptom. I mention it only because a certain number of people have quietly stopped marking the birthday and feel guilty about it, and a certain number have never missed one and feel trapped by it, and both groups believe there is a right answer. It is worth adding one more thing about the parallel life. It is not a delusion, and it does not need correcting. People who do this know perfectly well that the person is dead. The arithmetic is not confusion, it is a form of continued relationship conducted in the only tense available. Occasionally, somebody worries that they are living in a fantasy. They are not. The test is simple, and they always pass it. They know exactly what happened and would tell you the date. It is worth adding what happens with the arithmetic much later, in the last part of a life. It often reverses. People in their 80s who lost a child at 30 frequently report that the child has become, in some way, younger than them, in a way that stopped mattering, and that the arithmetic, which ran for 50 years, quietly stopped. There is very little research on this, and almost none of it is good. It is reported often enough in the qualitative literature to be worth mentioning, and not firmly enough to be worth claiming. I include it only because a certain number of people carrying this expect the counting to go on forever, and the accounts from people much further along suggest that it does not always. One more thing about the counting, and it is for anybody who has never had a child and is wondering why this chapter is here. The same arithmetic runs on everybody. The parent who would have been 80 this year, the friend who would have retired last spring, the sibling who would have met your children. It is not specific to bereaved parents. It is what the mind does with any relationship that was interrupted rather than concluded, and it is one of the most reliably reported experiences in the whole of the grief literature. Nobody chooses to do it. It simply runs quietly in the background for as long as you are here, and it is not a symptom of anything except having known somebody. Chapter 31. What it does to the body. Something practical, because grief is usually discussed as though it happened only in the mind, and a great many people are frightened by the physical side and do not connect it. Bereavement measurably disrupts sleep, and the disruption is one of the most consistently documented effects there is. Appetite goes in either direction. Concentration and short-term memory become genuinely unreliable, to a degree that alarms people who think they are losing their faculties. There is a well-documented elevation in physical illness and in mortality in the period after a major bereavement, particularly for spouses, particularly in the first 6 months. It is real and it is measurable, and it is one of the reasons that the practical business of eating and sleeping is not a triviality, and there is a condition, first properly described in Japan in the 1990s, in which acute emotional stress produces a temporary weakening of the heart muscle that mimics a heart attack on presentation and generally resolves. It has a name that translates roughly as broken heart syndrome, and it is a real cardiological entity with real diagnostic criteria. I am not telling you this to alarm you. I am telling you because a very large number of bereaved people privately believe that their physical state means something is wrong with them beyond the loss, and it is worth knowing that the body does this, that it is documented, and that it is a reason to see a doctor for ordinary practical reasons rather than a reason to be frightened. It is worth adding the practical instruction that follows from all that. See a doctor about the body, not about the grief. Not because the grief does not matter, but because the physical consequences are real, treatable, and frequently missed, and because a bereaved person who goes to a doctor about sleep or blood pressure or chest pain is far more likely to actually go than one who is told to seek help for their feelings. Whatever else is true, the 6 months after a major bereavement are a period of measurably elevated physical risk, and that is a reason for an appointment regardless of how you are coping emotionally. It is worth adding one more physical fact, because it explains something people find frightening. Grief impairs cognition measurably. Working memory, attention, and processing speed are all affected, particularly in the early months. People forget appointments, lose things, cannot follow a paragraph, and drive badly. That is documented, it is temporary, and it is not early dementia, which is what a substantial number of bereaved people over 60 privately fear. It is also a reason not to make large, irreversible decisions in the first year, which is advice everybody gives and almost nobody explains the basis for. It is worth adding one physical fact that people are most reluctant to raise. Bereavement affects appetite, sleep, concentration, and libido, and the last of those is almost never mentioned to anybody. It goes in either direction. Both are extremely common, and both cause a great deal of private shame. One because it feels like a further loss, the other because it feels like a betrayal. Neither is a symptom of anything. It is one of the more universal features of acute grief and one of the least discussed, and it is worth knowing simply so that it can stop being evidence about your character. It is worth adding one thing about the physical side and older listeners specifically. The risk period after losing a spouse is real and is highest in the first 6 months, which is a reason, and it is a reason worth stating plainly, to keep medical appointments during the exact period in which nobody can be bothered with them. The prescriptions still need collecting. The checkup still matters. The thing you had been meaning to get looked at last spring still needs looking at. That is not a small point dressed up as a large one. It is one of the few places where practical action after a bereavement measurably changes an outcome. Chapter 32. The Ones Who Disappeared. Here is a thing that happens which almost nobody warns you about, and which produces a second injury on top of the first. Some people go away, not enemies, friends, people you would have counted on. They come to the funeral, and they are genuinely upset, and then they are gone, and they do not come back, and when you eventually see them, they are strange with you. That is extremely common, and it is well described in the social support literature, and the reasons are almost never what the bereaved person concludes. They are frightened of saying the wrong thing, so they say nothing. They believe you want to be left alone because you said so once, 3 days after, when you did. They have their own history that this has reactivated. They think, sincerely, that they would be intruding. And some of them simply cannot be near it, because it makes their own future too visible. What the bereaved person concludes at 1 a.m. is that they were not really friends, or that they themselves have become unbearable. Usually, neither is true. Usually, it is fear and inarticulacy, and the total absence in modern life of any script for this. That is not a reason to forgive everybody. Some absences are genuinely a failure, and you are entitled to notice. But it is worth knowing that the pattern is nearly universal, that it is documented, and that it says considerably more about how badly our culture equips people for this than about you. It is worth adding what to do about the people who went away, because there is a version of this that is recoverable. Some of them come back if given a door. Not all. Some are simply gone, and that is its own small loss on top of the large one. But a substantial number are standing at a distance, having concluded months ago that they left it too long and that it would now be strange to say anything, and are waiting for a signal that it would be welcome. A short message that mentions the person by name is usually enough. It should not be your job to do that, and it is often the only thing that works. It is worth adding what to do about the ones who stayed. Tell them. People who turn up in the second year, who say the name, who ask a specific question, almost never know that they are doing something rare. They think they are doing the minimum. And the bereaved person very often does not say anything, because it feels excessive to thank somebody for ordinary decency. It is not ordinary. It is unusual, and it costs nothing to say so, and it makes it very much more likely that they will keep doing it. It is worth adding what to do about the ones who said the wrong thing. Most of them meant well and got it wrong under pressure. There is no script in this culture. People are handed a situation with no available words and improvise, and the improvisation is frequently terrible, and they usually know it within about 4 seconds. Some of it is unforgivable, and you are entitled to keep that. Most of it is a decent person panicking. The distinction is worth making, not for their sake, but because the alternative is to lose a substantial number of relationships to a category of remark that almost nobody produces deliberately. Chapter 33. The Second Year. One more thing that nobody tells you, and it is the single most useful piece of practical information in this recording: the second year is often harder than the first. Everybody expects the first year to be the worst, and in one sense it is. But the first year has a particular character. Shock, which is anesthetic. A great deal of practical business, which occupies, and a large amount of attention from other people. Then the anniversary passes, and everybody, including you, quietly assumes that a corner has been turned. And the second year arrives with the anesthetic gone, the practical business finished, the attention withdrawn, and the permanence finally legible. The first year you are getting through it. The second year you begin to understand that this is simply how it is now. People are routinely blindsided by that and conclude they are going backwards and are frightened. You are not going backwards. The second year is when it becomes real, and it becoming real is not a relapse. It is the thing itself, arriving late, on schedule, exactly as it does for almost everybody, and nobody having mentioned it in advance. It is worth adding the other thing that lands in the second year, because it catches people badly. The world has finished. Not just friends. Institutions. Forms stop asking. The employer's compassionate leave ended long ago. The anniversary passed and was marked and is now considered dealt with. And you are, at that point, further from the person than you have ever been, and the distance is still increasing, and nobody around you is thinking about it at all. Which is why the second year is when people most often seek help, and why anybody offering help should assume that the useful time to turn up is not the first fortnight, but the following spring. It is worth adding the practical consequence for anybody supporting somebody. Put a reminder in your calendar for a year from now. Not the anniversary, which people manage. Some ordinary week in the middle of the second year, when everybody else has stopped, and send a message that mentions the name. That is the single highest value thing anybody outside the household can do. It takes 90 seconds and almost nobody does it, because by then everybody has assumed the matter is settled. It is worth adding one more feature of the second year. The dreams change. In the first year, where people dream of the person at all, the dreams are often distressing or confused. Later, they frequently become ordinary. The person is simply present, doing something unremarkable, and the dream is not about the death at all. Many people find those enormously valuable, and are reluctant to say so. There is very little research on it, and nothing I would present as a finding. It is worth mentioning only because a great many bereaved people have had one and assumed it was theirs alone. It is worth adding one more thing about the second year that is genuinely good news. It is the year most people start to be able to remember properly. In the first year, memories of the person are frequently dominated by the death. The illness, the hospital, the last weeks, the phone call. The person before that is hard to reach, which is one of the crueler features of acute grief. Later, and it is often somewhere in the second or third year, the earlier material starts coming back, the ordinary decades, the person as they mostly were, rather than as they were at the end. Nobody warns people about that either, and a great many spend the first year frightened that they have lost access to everything except the worst part. It is worth adding one more thing about time that people find hard to believe when they are early in it. The good memories come back stronger than the bad ones, eventually, in most people. Not immediately, and not for everybody, and not on any schedule anybody can promise. But the general direction reported over long periods is that the death recedes as the dominant content, and the person, as they were for decades, reasserts itself. Which is worth having at 1 a.m. in the first year, when the last weeks are all that is available, and it feels as though the whole relationship has been overwritten by its ending. It has not. It is only that the ending is nearest. Chapter 34. When it is more than this. The necessary chapter, and on this subject I want to be precise. If your life has stopped and stayed stopped, if you are not eating or sleeping in any regular way months on, if you have withdrawn from everybody, if you cannot work at all, if the loss is the only thing there is, all day, every day, with no intervals, if there is anything at all like the thought that you would rather not be here. That last one is not a shameful thought, and it is more common in bereavement than people admit. It is also a reason to speak to somebody today, not eventually. There is treatment specifically for this. It is not the same as treatment for depression, and it works. There are bereavement services in every country, most of them free, and there are ones specifically for parents. Please use them, and please do not decide at 1 a.m. that you are the exception. It is worth adding one specific thing about the treatment, because people assume it means talking about it endlessly. It does not. The therapies with the best evidence for prolonged grief are structured, time-limited, and involve a specific set of exercises rather than open-ended discussion. They typically run to a defined number of sessions. They are also, importantly, different from standard depression treatment, which is part of why identifying the condition mattered. People were being treated for the wrong thing and were not getting better, and were then concluding that nothing worked. It is a short, specific, effective intervention for a small and identifiable group, and the main obstacle to it remains that almost nobody knows it exists. It is worth adding one thing about how to get help without a diagnosis. You do not need to meet any criteria to speak to a bereavement service. They are not diagnostic gateways. Most of them are free, most of them do not require a referral, and nobody is going to assess whether your grief is severe enough to qualify. That matters, because a great many people who would be helped enormously never make the call, on the grounds that other people have it worse and that they are probably fine and that they would be taking a place from somebody who needs it more. There is no queue. That is not how it works. It is worth adding what to expect from a first appointment, because not knowing is a real obstacle. Very little. Somebody asks what happened and listens. There is no assessment to pass, no requirement to cry, and nothing you have to have worked out in advance. Most bereavement services will see you for a small number of sessions and will say plainly if they think something more specific is needed. The image people carry of being examined and found either sufficiently damaged or not is not what the room is like, and that image keeps a very large number of people out of it. It is worth adding one more thing about when to go. Sooner than you think, and for less reason than you think. The most common pattern is that people wait until they are certain it is bad enough, which means waiting until it is quite bad, which means arriving at the point where there is more to undo. There is no threshold. You are allowed to speak to somebody because it has been a hard 6 months, and you would like to say some things out loud to a person who is not in your family. That is a completely legitimate use of a bereavement service, and it is what most of their work actually is. Chapter 35. Nothing is owed tonight, and the name. We are nearly at the end. Whatever came up during this recording, and whatever comes up in the hour after it stops, there is nothing owed. No conclusion has to be reached, no meaning has to be extracted, no stage has to be completed. The person you are missing is not waiting for you to finish anything. If it comes tonight, let it come and let it go again, which it will, because it always has, and because the intervals are the mechanism. I would like to end with the smallest thing in the whole evening. An old monk in a forest, 66 years old and in poor health, sitting in a room with a queue of people outside who have walked a very long way. A woman comes in. She has lost her 4th child and cannot stop. And the first thing he does, before any theology, before any comfort, before anything else at all, is ask her his name. That is the whole of it. That is the entire technique. Everything else in the passage follows from it. Say the name. Ask for the name. Do not let the name go out of the room. It is worth adding why the name matters so much, because it looks like a small thing, and it is not. The bereaved almost universally want to hear it, and almost never do. Everybody around them avoids it, for the same reason, fear of causing pain by reminding, which is based on a misunderstanding so complete, it would be funny if it were not so costly. You cannot remind somebody of a thing they have not stopped thinking about for a single hour. What the avoidance actually communicates is that the person has been removed from the record, too uncomfortable to mention, gradually edited out of ordinary conversation, until the bereaved person is the only one who ever says the name out loud. The elder asks for the name in the first 30 seconds. That is not piety. It is the single most useful thing anybody does in the whole scene. It is worth adding one last thing about the name. Use it in the present tense where you can. Not she was, always. She is my sister. He is my son. Those are still true. The relationship did not end, only the person. Many bereaved people find the enforced past tense one of the harder daily impositions, and they change it back privately without ever mentioning it to anybody. You are allowed to say it out loud. Nobody will correct you, and if they do, they are wrong. It is worth adding the last thing about names, and it is for anybody listening who is not bereaved. Ask. If somebody you know lost a person and you have never heard about them, ask what they were like. Not how the person is coping, what the one who died was like. It is the question bereaved people most want and most rarely get, because everybody assumes it would be intrusive, and it is very close to the opposite. You will not remind them, they have not stopped. You will only be the one person that month who behaved as though the person had existed. Chapter 36. Let it be. So here is the last of it. You do not have to have grown. You do not have to be over it or further along than you are, and you do not have to be able to say what it taught you when somebody asks at a table. There is no schedule you are behind on. Because there is no schedule, there are no stages. The woman who is supposed to have described them was studying dying patients rather than bereaved ones, and said in print that they were never a sequence and spent years trying to take it back. Feeling fine on a Tuesday afternoon is not a betrayal. It is the other half of the mechanism, and without it nobody would survive the first half. Keeping them is not a failure to let go. It is what most bereaved people in most of the world have always done, and the theory that said otherwise was built in 1917 out of a model of the mind that no longer exists by a man who kept his daughter's photograph on his desk until he died. And not being able to make it mean anything is not a failure either. He could not. He was better placed than almost anybody who has ever lived, with a faith he held seriously, a monastery, an elder, a vocation, and a public. And when it was his own son, he wrote the strongest case against the whole idea that anybody has written, and he never answered it. And he said so. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let the weight of your legs go, and your hands, and the back of your head, into whatever is holding you. Nothing has to be decided tonight. Nothing has to be concluded. No part of this has to be finished before morning. And there is no version of you at 11 tomorrow who needs you to have worked anything out in the dark. The person you are missing is not waiting for you to complete anything. If it comes tonight, let it come. And when it goes, let it go, which it will, because it always has. And the going is not a betrayal either. An old monk in a room in a forest. 66 years old, in poor health, receiving people all day, with a queue outside of men and women who had walked for weeks. A woman comes in, she has lost her 4th child and cannot stop, and she has left her home and her husband and is simply walking. And before the theology, and before the comfort, and before anything else at all, he asks her the boy's name. She tells him. He says it back to her. That is the whole of it. Everything else in the passage follows from that, and everything useful anybody has learned in the 145 years since is a longer way of saying the same thing. Say the name. Ask for the name. Do not let it go out of the room. There is nothing further to work out tonight. Sleep now.